My childhood home wasn't just a house. It was a museum of uncheckable truths. It was a rambling Victorian on the coast of Maine, with a wraparound porch that smelled of salt and hydrangeas, and windows that stared out at the moody, gray Atlantic. Every object within its walls told a story, a chapter in the perfect, tragic, and beautiful narrative of my family. The central exhibit, the heart of our museum, was the story of my father, David. I was a corporate lawyer in New York now, a man who dealt in the harsh black and white reality of contracts and litigation. But every summer, I would shed that skin and return to the soft, sepia-toned world of my childhood home. My mother, Eleanor, still lived there, a graceful, silver-haired sentinel guarding our family's history. She was my anchor, my true north. Our bond was forged in a shared, profound grief that had defined both our lives. My father, David, was a fisherman, a man as rugged and kind as the Maine coast itself. When I was 8 years old, his boat, the Albatross, was caught in a sudden, violent nor'easter. He was lost to the sea. There was no body, just a splintered piece of the hull that washed ashore a week later, bearing the boat's name. His death became the foundational myth of my life. I grew up in the shadow of a hero, a man who had battled the ocean and lost. My mother nurtured this myth with a fierce, quiet devotion. His photograph, a handsome, smiling man with the sea in his eyes, sat on the mantelpiece like a household god. We spoke of him in the present tense. "Your father loves this time of year," she would say, or "This was your father's favorite song. He wasn't gone, he was just away." Our home was a shrine to his memory. His fishing trophies still gleamed on the shelves. His worn copy of Moby Dick still sat on the bedside table. His oilskin jacket still hung on a peg by the back door, as if he might walk in at any moment, shaking the sea from his hair. The shared sacred grief was the bedrock of my relationship with my mother. It was the uncheckable truth upon which my entire reality was built. This summer, I arrived a day earlier than planned, wanting to surprise her. I let myself in with my old key, the familiar scent of lemon polish and sea air wrapping around me. Like a blanket, the house was quiet. I called out for her, but there was no answer. I figured she was in the garden. I walked through the silent house, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. I headed towards the back porch, which overlooked her magnificent garden and the sea beyond. As I reached the French doors, I heard voices, a low murmur, and then I heard my mother laugh. It wasn't her usual soft, gentle laugh. This was different. It was a full, throaty, joyous sound, a sound I hadn't heard since I was a little boy. A sound from before the storm. I peered through the glass, and my world tilted on its axis. She was sitting at the small bistro table on the porch, a place usually reserved for her solitary morning tea. Across from her sat a man. He was a stranger. He had a weathered, tanned face, a thick beard streaked with gray, and hands that were calloused and strong. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt, and he was leaning forward, his eyes full of a deep, familiar warmth fixed on my mother. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. It was an act of casual, profound intimacy that felt like a punch to the gut. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A handyman? A neighbor? But the look on my mother's face shattered those possibilities. It was a look of pure, unguarded adoration. A look I had only ever seen in the old photographs of her and my father. I must have made a sound, a sharp intake of breath, because they both turned. The man's hand flew from my mother's as if he'd been burned. My mother's face, which had been so alive and vibrant, collapsed into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Alex," she gasped, standing up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the flagstones. You're early." I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. My eyes were locked on the stranger, who now stood awkwardly, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Mom," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Who is this?" This is Mr. Corrigan," she stammered, her hands fluttering nervously. "He's a local historian. He was just helping me with some research about the town." The lie was so blatant, so poorly constructed, it was almost insulting. A historian? The man looked like he had spent his entire life on the deck of a boat. His hands were the hands of a man who worked with rope and wood, not books and archives. "I should be going," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He wouldn't look at me. He gave my mother a quick, almost imperceptible nod, and then walked quickly down the porch steps and disappeared around the side of the house. I stood there, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air was thick with the unspoken. A historian? I finally said, turning to my mother. "Alex, please," she said, her eyes pleading. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "For 30 years, this house has been a mausoleum. For 30 years, we have lived and breathed the memory of my father. And now I come home to find you laughing with a strange man on the back." "Porch like a schoolgirl? Who is he, Mom?" Tears welled in her eyes. "He's just a friend." "I don't believe you," I said, the words cold and hard. Her face crumpled. "Please, Alex, just let it be, for my sake." But I couldn't. It was more than just jealousy or shock. It was a sense of profound violation. The stranger's presence felt like a desecration of the most sacred space in my life. It was a crack in the foundation of my reality, and I had to know how deep it went. That night, sleep was impossible. The image of the man's hand on my mother's was burned into my mind. The next morning, my mother acted as if nothing had happened, her cheerfulness so forced it was painful. I excused myself, saying I was going for a walk into town, but I had a different destination in mind. I drove to the town hall, to the public records office. I didn't know what I was looking for. I just started digging. I looked up property records for our address, and then I looked up the records for our neighbor, a small, weathered cottage next door that had been owned by a reclusive old fisherman named Silas Black, who had passed away a few years ago. The cottage had been sold recently. The new owner's name was listed as Michael Corrigan. My blood ran cold. He wasn't a visitor. He lived next door. My mother had lied. Driven by a suspicion I couldn't yet name, I started digging deeper. I pulled the old maritime records for the year my father's boat went down. I had seen the official report 100 times. The Albatross, captained by David Hawley, lost at sea during an unseasonal nor'easter. One soul on board, presumed deceased. But today I looked at the supplementary documents, the witness statements from other fishermen who had been out that day. One name appeared several times. A fisherman on another boat, the Sea Serpent, had been the last to see the Albatross before the storm hit. He reported seeing it heading out towards the treacherous shoals, a place my father, an experienced seaman, would have known to avoid in bad weather. The fisherman's name was Michael Corrigan. My heart felt like it was going to beat its way out of my chest. He knew my father. He was there. He was the last person to see him alive. And my mother had him living next door, drinking tea on her back porch. And she had lied to my face about who he was. I went back to the house, my mind a raging storm of questions and accusations. My mother was in the kitchen, arranging flowers. I went to the town hall, I said, my voice flat. "Michael Corrigan. He lives next door, and he was a fisherman. He was out on the water the day Dad died." My mother dropped the vase. It shattered. On the floor, water and flowers spilling across the tiles. She didn't seem to notice. She just stared at me, her face a mask of utter devastation. The secret she had been keeping for 30 years had finally, violently broken the surface. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you have to understand." "Understand what?" I yelled, the rage and confusion finally boiling over. "That you've been lying to me my whole life? That the man who was with my father when he died is your... what? Your friend? Your lover? He's not my lover," she cried, her voice cracking. He's more than that." I stared at her, my mind refusing to comprehend. "What is he to you, Mom? Tell me the truth." She sank into a kitchen chair, her body trembling. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a grief so profound it seemed to swallow the light in the room. When she finally spoke, her words were a whisper that demolished the entire museum of my life, shattering every uncheckable truth I had ever known. "Michael Corrigan isn't just a friend, Alex," she wept. "He's your father." The words hung in the air of the sun-drenched kitchen, impossible and monstrous. "He's your father." My mind simply refused to process them. It was a glitch in the matrix. A sentence in a language I didn't speak. "No," I said, the word coming out as a choked, strangled sound. "No, my father was David Hall. He died at sea. He was a hero." "David Hawley was a hero," my mother whispered, her gaze fixed on the shattered vase on the floor. "But he wasn't your father, and he didn't die at sea." The world began to spin. the familiar kitchen walls seeming to warp and bend around me. I sank into the chair opposite her, my legs no longer able to support me. My mother, Eleanor, the woman who had been the bedrock of my existence, began to speak, and with every word, she dismantled the world she had so carefully constructed for me. The story she told was not one of tragic, romantic love. It was a story of fear, desperation, and a terrible, necessary lie. She and my father, David, had been deeply in love. That their marriage was not the idyllic partnership I had been raised to believe in. David was a good man, but he was also a man with a dark side, a possessive, jealous streak that intensified after I was born. He became controlling, his love twisting into a form of ownership. Michael Corrigan, the man I had seen on the porch, was David's best friend. They had grown up together, worked the same boats, and were as close as brothers. But as David's possessiveness grew, he began to see Michael not as a friend, but as a rival. He became consumed by an irrational, unfounded jealousy, convinced that my mother and Michael were having an affair. It was a torment in his mind, Alex, my mother said, her voice trembling with the memory of it. There was nothing between Michael and me, not then, but David couldn't see it. He forbade me from speaking to Michael. He checked my phone calls. He turned our home, this beautiful house, into a prison. The breaking point came when I was 8 years old. David's paranoia had reached a fever pitch. He had lost a significant amount of money in a bad investment, and he blamed his failure on the distraction of his suspicions. He became volatile, his mood swinging wildly. One evening, he confronted my mother, his eyes wild with a rage she had never seen before. He told her he was taking me away, that they were going to disappear and move to South America, where he could keep an eye on me without Michael's interference. He was going to take you from me, she wept. He was going to take my son and vanish. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. That night, she did the only thing she could think of. She called Michael. She broke David's rule, a desperate act of a terrified mother. She met Michael in secret and told him everything. Michael, who had seen his friend's descent into instability, was horrified. Together, they hatched a desperate plan. The nor'easter that was forecast for the next day was their only chance. Michael knew David was planning to take the albatross out, despite the weather warnings. The plan was for Michael to convince David to take him along, to try and talk some sense into him, to get him to see a doctor. But David, in his agitated state, refused. The lie they constructed was born of that desperate night. Michael would go out in his own boat. He would witness the albatross going down in the storm. He would be the sole, tragic witness to his best friend's demise. It was a terrible, audacious lie, but it was the only way my mother could see to protect me, to keep her son from being taken from her by a man who was losing his grip. But he didn't die, I whispered, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. David, what happened to him? He left, she said. The plan was for him to just disappear. He took the money he had left and he walked away. He agreed to it. He saw it as his only escape from his financial ruin and his own demons. The storm was his cover story. It allowed him to die without dying, to escape his life without the shame of failure. So the heroic father I had worshipped my entire life wasn't a hero at all. He was a coward. A man who had abandoned his family, who had faked his own death to escape his responsibilities. And my mother, my gentle, grieving mother, had been the architect of the entire deception. And Michael? I asked, my voice flat. Where does he fit in? Why is he here now, Michael? He was my rock, she said, finally looking at me, her eyes pleading for understanding. After David left, he was the only one who knew the truth. He supported us from a distance. He never overstepped. He respected the story, but a few years ago, he got sick, a bad heart. He had no family of his own. He wanted to come home to Port Blossom to live out his days. He bought the cottage next door. He wanted to be close to his son. The words hit me again, a fresh wave of nausea. My father, I said, the words feeling alien on my tongue, is Michael Corrigan. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, it was before David and I were married, a single night. A mistake, we thought, but it resulted in the most wonderful thing in my life, you. I was going to tell David, but I found out I was pregnant right after he proposed. I was a stupid, scared girl. I was afraid he would leave me. So I let him believe you were his, and Michael. Michael agreed to keep the secret. He loved David like a brother. He didn't want to be the one to break his heart. So my entire life, every memory, every uncheckable truth was a lie. My father wasn't the man on the mantelpiece. He was the stranger on the back porch. My mother wasn't a grieving widow. She was a woman who had lived a 30-year lie to protect her son. And the sacred grief that had been the foundation of our bond was a shared fiction. I stood up, the kitchen chair scraping against the floor. I couldn't breathe. The walls of the museum were closing in, the artifacts of my life revealing themselves as forgeries. I need to go, I said, my voice hollow. Alex, please, she begged. Talk to him, talk to Michael. But I couldn't. I walked out of the kitchen, past the shattered vase, past the smiling photograph of the man who was not my father, and out the front door. I got in my car and just drove with no destination in mind. I was a man without a past, without a foundation, without a true north. The story of my life had been a lie, and I had no idea how to even begin to write a new one. I drove for hours, the rugged Maine coastline, a blur of pine and granite outside my window. My mind was a chaotic storm of images and emotions, my mother's. Tear-streaked face, the stranger's kind, familiar eyes, the photograph on the mantelpiece that was now a monument to a lie. I ended up in a dingy motel room 100 miles down the coast. The scent of stale cigarettes and antiseptic a fitting backdrop for the demolition of my reality. For 2 days, I didn't answer my mother's frantic calls. I didn't answer the texts from a number I didn't recognize, which I knew belonged to Michael. I sat in the darkness, replaying my life, examining every memory for the cracks I had never seen before. I was a man built on a foundation of secrets and lies. The anger came first. A white-hot rage at my mother for her deception, at Michael for his silence, and at David for his cowardice. How could they have done this? How could they have let me live a lie for my entire life? My grief for the father I thought I had lost was now replaced by a bitter, confusing resentment for the two fathers. I now had one a fraud, the other a stranger, but beneath the anger, there was something else. A deep, aching curiosity. I was a lawyer. I dealt in facts and evidence. My mother had given me her version of the story, a narrative steeped in fear and emotion. I needed to find my own truth. On the third day, I drove back to Port Blossom. But I didn't go home. I went to the town's small maritime museum, a place I had loved as a child. It was a dusty, cluttered building filled with ship models, old fishing gear, and the ghosts of the town's seafaring past. I knew they kept an archive of old logbooks from local fishing vessels. I spent the entire day in their musty archive room, poring over the logbooks from the year I turned 8. I found the log for the Sea Serpent, Michael Corrigan's boat. His entries were sparse, just notes on weather, tides, and catch numbers. But on the day of the storm, the day my father died, the entry was different. It was longer, his usually steady handwriting, almost illegible. October 12th. Nor'easter hit like a freight train. Wind and an E, gusting to 70, seas 20 feet. Saw the albatross heading for the shoals. Radioed him, no response. Last saw him near Black Rock. God help him, God help us all. It corroborated my mother's story, at least on the surface. But then I found the logbook for another boat, the Wanderer, captained by an old fisherman named Silas Black, the man whose cottage Michael now lived in. Silas was a notorious curmudgeon, but his logs were known for their meticulous detail. His entry for that day was chilling. October 12th, devil of a storm, came out of nowhere, most boats headed in. Saw young David Hawley in the albatross. It looked like he was running from something, and saw Corrigan and the Sea Serpent behind him. Not with him, following him. Something ain't right about it. A man doesn't chase his friend into the teeth of a killer storm. Following him, not trying to help him. Chasing him, a cold dread washed over me. This wasn't a story of a desperate plan to save a child. This was something darker. I left the museum and went to the only other place I could think of. The old, salty tavern by the docks, the Salty Dog. It was a place where old fishermen, the living archives of the town, went to drink and trade stories. I found a few of them at the bar, men with faces like weathered maps of the coastline. I bought around and I started asking questions. I didn't mention my mother or Michael. I just asked about the old days, about the storm of '93, about my father, David Hawley. Oh, I remember Davy, one old-timer said, his voice raspy. Good fisherman, but a jealous man. Madly in love with his wife, Eleanor. Couldn't see straight for it, and his temper, it got worse near the end. The end. I asked, another one chimed in. He got into it badly with his best friend, Mike Corrigan. Accused him of all sorts of things with Eleanor. It was ugly. The whole town knew it. Then came the storm, and that was the end of Davy Hall. What about Corrigan? I asked, my voice tight. The old man shrugged. Mike was never the same after. He was a haunted man. Sold his boat a few years later and just drifted. Only came back recently after old Silas passed. I had enough. I walked out of the tavern, the salty air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. The story was shifting again, the truth becoming murkier, more dangerous. This wasn't just a lie born of desperation. It was a lie born of a dark, difficult secret that had been buried at sea for 30 years. I drove back to my childhood home, my mind reeling. I needed to confront them. Not just my mother, but both of them, together. I found them on the back porch, sitting at the small bistro table, a space that was now tainted with my discovery. They looked up as I approached, their faces etched with anxiety. I know, I said, my voice cold and hard. I know you weren't helping him, Michael. You were following him, chasing him into the storm. Michael's weathered face seemed to age another 10 years. He looked at my mother, a look of profound, shared sorrow passing between them. Alex, my mother began, her voice pleading. No, I said, holding up a hand. No more stories, no more lies. I want the truth, the real truth. What happened on that boat? Michael finally looked at me, his sea-colored eyes, my eyes, filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. When he spoke, his voice was the low rumble of a distant, approaching storm. David didn't just leave, Alex, he said quietly. He didn't just walk away. He tried to kill me. And I had to stop him. The confession hung in the air between us, as heavy and oppressive as the calm before a hurricane. The story I thought I had finally pieced together shattered once again, revealing an even darker, more terrifying reality beneath. Michael, my father began to speak, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing this confession in the silence of his own heart for 3 decades. My mother sat beside him, her hand clutching his, her eyes closed as if she couldn't bear to hear the story told aloud, yet needed to be there to anchor him to the present. The plan had been just as my mother had described it, a desperate, flawed idea to get David away from me, to fake his death and give him a chance to escape his demons. Michael was supposed to stay in port, to be just another fisherman who saw his friend sail off into a storm. But David, in his state of intense suspicion, had become wary. He had accused Michael of plotting with my mother, of trying to get rid of him. He called me that morning, Michael said, his gaze fixed on the distant gray horizon. He was ranting. Said he knew we were trying to trap him. He said if he was going down, he was taking me with him. He told me to meet him at the boat, that we were going to settle things once and for all, out on the water. Michael knew it was a trap, but he went anyway. He still believed he could reason with the man who had been his brother. He went to the Albatross and found David not just angry, but deeply unstable. David pulled a small, rusty handgun. He told Michael that they were going for one last ride, that only one of them would be coming back. He was a different person. Alex, Michael whispered, the man I knew was gone. All that was left was the rage and the jealousy. He forced me onto the boat. As we headed out, the storm was already building. I tried to talk to him, to calm him down, but he was beyond reason. Out on the churning, open sea, with the storm bearing down on them, David's rage finally exploded. He told Michael he was going to harm him, then scuttle the boat and disappear, leaving everyone to believe they had both been lost in the storm. It was a desperate, destructive plan born of a troubled mind. As the first massive waves began to crash over the deck, they fought. It was a fierce, desperate struggle on the slick, pitching deck of the boat, surrounded by the roaring wind and sea. David was stronger, fueled by a frenzied strength, but Michael was a more experienced seaman. The gun went off once, the shot going wild, lost in the shriek of the wind. He was going to kill me, Michael said, his voice cracking. I saw it in his eyes. There was no doubt. The boat was taking on water, starting to break apart under the force of the waves. I managed to get the gun away from him. He lunged at me, and we went over the side, into the freezing, violent water. They were separated in the churning chaos. Michael clung to a piece of wreckage, the waves crashing over him, his body growing numb from the cold. He saw David, a few yards away, struggling to stay afloat. I tried to get to him, Michael said, his voice thick with a 30-year-old grief. even after everything I tried. But a massive wave, a rogue, came out of the dark. It picked him up and threw him against the rocks at the base of the cliffs. And then he was gone. The sea took him. Michael was the sole survivor. He managed to cling to the wreckage until the storm passed, where he was found hours later by another boat, suffering from severe hypothermia and shock. When he was able to speak, he was faced with an impossible choice. He could tell the truth, that his best friend had become dangerously unstable, had tried to kill him, and had died in the struggle. But he knew that story would destroy my mother. It would taint my father's memory forever, replacing the image of a heroic fisherman with that of a violent, troubled man. It would leave me, an 8-year-old boy, with a legacy of violence and turmoil. So he lied. He and my mother, in their shared shock and grief, made a pact. They created the story of the hero lost at sea. They buried the truth of that day deep in the ocean, hoping it would never surface. Michael, haunted by what had happened, couldn't bear to stay in Port Blossom. He sold his boat and left, becoming a ghost himself, wandering the country for decades, living with the secret. "We did it to protect you, Alex," my mother said, her voice a desperate plea. "We wanted you to have a good man to look up to. We wanted you to have a father you could be proud of, even if he was just a memory. We didn't want you to be the son of a man who broke." I sat there, the story finally complete, the truth laid bare in all its ugly, heartbreaking complexity. My father, David, was neither the hero I had worshipped, nor the coward I had despised. He was a tragic, broken man, a victim of his own demons. And Michael, the man who was my biological father, had not been silent out of weakness, but out of a profound, misguided sense of love and protection. He had sacrificed his own right to be my father to preserve the memory of the man who had tried to kill him. The anger and resentment that had been churning inside me began to recede, replaced by a vast, aching sadness. A sadness for the father I had never known, for the father who had been forced to be a stranger, and for the mother who had carried the weight of this impossible secret alone for 30 years. The museum of my life was in ruins. The exhibits were shattered, the truths revealed as forgeries. But standing in the rubble, for the first time, I felt a strange sense of peace. The lies were gone. All that was left was the difficult, painful, and beautiful truth. The days that followed were quiet and strange, like the calm after a storm had passed, leaving a landscape that is both familiar and irrevocably changed. There were no more secrets. We talked for hours, the three of us, on the back porch that had once been the stage for my world's collapse. We filled in the 30 years of silence with stories, with questions, with tears, and eventually, with a tentative, fragile laughter, I learned about Michael. I learned about his life as a drifter, working on fishing boats from Alaska to Florida, always carrying the quiet weight of his past. I learned that he had my mother's eyes and my own stubborn refusal to give up. I learned that he had followed my career from afar, cutting out newspaper articles about my legal successes, a proud father hidden in the shadows. I learned about my mother. I saw her not as the serene, grieving widow I had always known, but as a fierce, pragmatic survivor, a woman who had made an impossible choice to protect her son, and who had lived with the consequences of that choice every single day. The pedestal I had put her on crumbled, but in its place stood a real woman, flawed and fierce, and more worthy of my love than the perfect saint I had imagined. And I told them about my life, about the pressure to live up to the memory of a hero, about the loneliness I felt even in a crowded city, about the sense of rootlessness that had haunted me my entire life. And they listened. Letting go of David, the father of my childhood, was the hardest part. It was like mourning him all over again, but this time I was mourning the man he really was, not the myth. One afternoon, I took a handsome, smiling photograph from the mantelpiece. I looked at it for a long time, and then I put it away in my old shoebox, alongside the faded picture of my mother. He was no longer a god to be worshipped, but a man to be understood, a part of my history, but not the entirety of it in his place. On the mantel, I put a new photograph. It was one my cousin, my real cousin, Michael's nephew, took off the three of us on the beach. My mother, Michael, and me. We weren't smiling a perfect posed smile. We were laughing, squinting into the sun, the wind whipping our hair. We looked messy, real, and happy. I extended my stay in Port Blossom. I took a leave of absence from my high-powered law firm in New York, a world that suddenly felt sterile and meaningless. I spent my days in the bookstore with my Aunt Sarah, and on the water with my Uncle Ben. And my father, Michael, he taught me how to read the tides, how to mend a net, how to find my way by the stars. He was teaching me the language of his world, the language of my heritage. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in strokes of orange and purple, Michael turned to me. "I know I can never replace David," he said. Quietly, "I can never give you back the father you thought you had." "You don't have to," I said, looking out at the calm, endless sea. "I'm not a boy anymore. I don't need a hero to worship. I'd like to get to know my dad." A slow smile spread across his weathered face, a smile that reached his sea-colored eyes. "I'd like that too, son," he said. "I'd like that very much." My childhood home was no longer a museum of uncheckable truths. The lies had been cleared away, the forgeries removed. It was just a house now, a house by the sea, filled with the messy, complicated, and beautiful truth of a family that had been broken and was now, slowly, piece by piece, being put back together. The story of my life was no longer a myth written by others. It was a new blueprint, one I was finally ready to start drafting myself, with a foundation not of grief, but of a hard-won, beautiful, and authentic love.